Some tragedies don't begin with a major crime, a dangerous rivalry, or a long-running feud. Some begin with something so small, so painfully ordinary, that it almost feels impossible to believe. A simple parking space. Just a few feet of asphalt. Yet those few feet would eventually shatter two families, stun an entire neighborhood, and leave investigators wondering how a disagreement so small could grow into something deadly. The story you are about to hear isn't dramatic because of the violence. It's dramatic because of how avoidable it all seemed, right up until the moment it wasn't anymore. This is the case of the Morgan and Delgado families. Two ordinary households living on Maple Ridge Drive, a quiet suburban street known for its trimmed lawns and weekly block parties. People who lived there liked to say the street was peaceful, even predictable. But when you dig deep into this case, you'll see the truth. Peace can be fragile and predictability can be an illusion. Today we begin with the first cracks, moments small enough to ignore, but dangerous enough to grow. Because what happened between these families wasn't sudden rage. It was pressure that built quietly, slowly, and silently, until the day it exploded. Meet Daniel Morgan, age 42. He worked as an auto mechanic, the kind of man neighbors described as helpful but stubborn. He had a habit of noticing things, little details, and once something bothered him, he couldn't let it go. His wife, Lena Morgan, often joked that Daniel argued with telemarketers for fun. Still, most neighbors liked him. He was the guy who helped jumpstart your car or lent you a ladder. Across the street lived Carlos Delgado, age 39. A delivery driver, a father of two, and someone people saw as friendly but protective, especially when it came to his property. His wife Marisol often said Carlos had a switch. He could be calm one moment and fiery the next. Not violent, just reactive. Emotional. Quick to defend himself. The first time these two men spoke, it wasn't a fight. In fact, they got along. Daniel once fixed Carlos's flat tire for free. Their kids rode bikes on the same sidewalk. The families waved to each other on weekends. Everything looked normal. But Maple Ridge Drive had one annoying problem: limited parking. The street was narrow, the driveways were short, and visitors constantly squeezed into whatever space they could find. Most neighbors just accepted it. Daniel didn't. He liked order. He liked rules. When he worked on cars in his driveway, he needed space. And when strangers parked near his driveway, he felt crowded. Meanwhile, Carlos worked long hours, often leaving his house before sunrise and returning after dark. When his relatives visited, they sometimes parked wherever they found room, even if it was in the spot Daniel considered basically his. No one owned the street parking, of course, but personal territory is a complicated thing. It isn't marked by paint. It's marked by habit, comfort, and pride. The first conflict began on a Saturday morning. According to neighbors, Daniel walked outside to find Carlos's brother's car parked tight against the curb in front of his house. Not blocking his driveway, but close enough that it annoyed him. Daniel muttered something under his breath, walked back inside, and complained to Lena. She told him to let it go. "It's just a car, Dan. They'll leave." But Daniel didn't let things go. He walked across the street to talk to the Delgados. It wasn't a fight, more of a tense conversation. Witnesses say Daniel stood stiff, arms crossed. Carlos tried to stay calm, but his brother rolled his eyes, which only made things worse. The car was eventually moved and the moment passed. But something changed that day. A seed was planted. Small resentment on both sides, quiet but growing. A week later it happened again. Different visitor, same parking spot. This time Daniel didn't go over to talk. He called the non-emergency police line. Officers didn't ticket the car because nothing illegal had been done, but they did knock on the Delgado's door to notify them. Carlos felt embarrassed and angry. He walked outside afterward, stared at Daniel's house for a long moment, and shook his head. From there, the tension became part of neighborhood conversation. People whispered about it at mailboxes and over backyard fences. Yet both families tried to pretend life was normal. But small things kept happening. Daniel began placing orange traffic cones in front of his house when he expected to work on cars. They weren't official cones, but he acted like they were. Sometimes he left them even when he wasn't using the space, and that irritated Carlos. On the other side, the Delgados stopped waving at the Morgans. Not rude, just distant. Marisol said she didn't want trouble, so she kept to herself. Still, no one expected where this would eventually lead. One particular evening stands out, according to 3 neighbors who later provided statements. It was early summer. The kind of warm night where windows are open and sound travels easily. Carlos came home tired, frustrated after working a long shift. There was only one spot open near his house, the one in front of Daniel's home with the cones. He moved the cones aside and parked. What happened next became part of local lore. Daniel stormed outside, demanding Carlos move his truck. Carlos refused, saying he had a right to park anywhere on the street. Words flew back and forth, loud, sharp, personal. One neighbor said Daniel called Carlos selfish. Another said Carlos accused Daniel of pretending to own the whole block. Lena came outside trying to calm her husband. Marisol pulled her husband back toward their front steps. No punches were thrown. No threats were made. Eventually, both men walked away, breathing hard, humiliated but silent. Yet this was the moment when resentment hardened into something else, something heavier. Days passed, then weeks. But the tension stayed. The families no longer spoke. Children avoided crossing into each other's yards. Even neighbors felt uncomfortable walking between the houses. That's how it happens. Violence rarely starts with violence. It starts with silence, distance, and unspoken hurt. At this point in the story, the double murder was still far away. There were no weapons, no crimes, no police reports beyond that one small call. But the emotional fuse was already lit. All it needed was one more spark. And neither family saw it coming. So far, we've seen how a simple parking issue, a harmless inconvenience on most streets, grew into a heavy conflict between the Morgans and the Delgados. What began with a single annoyed complaint slowly expanded through repeated frustrations, small misunderstandings, and bruised pride. The 2 men, Daniel Morgan and Carlos Delgado, were not enemies, but their personalities clashed in ways neither man recognized as dangerous. This wasn't yet a crime story. It was a warning story, a sign of how everyday frustrations can twist into something darker when communication breaks down and pride stays in control. This is just the beginning. In Part 2, we'll explore the moment when the conflict stopped being verbal and crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. If you want to understand how a neighborhood argument turned into a tragic double murder, stay with this series and follow the next part. The truth behind this case is disturbing, surprising, and deeply human, and it's coming next.